My husband demanded we be brutally honest with each other. Challenge accepted. My husband Giorgio discovered a podcast about radical honesty in relationships and decided he was going to make it his entire personality. We need to start being completely honest with each other about everything because that's what mature couples do, he announced during dinner. I told him we were already honest with each other about the important things and that others things were better left unsaid. In reality, I know our marriage only worked at all because I knew how to bite my tongue. But he said, that's exactly the kind of toxic positivity that destroys marriages because you're prioritizing comfort over authentic connection. I tried to explain that he was actually pretty sensitive and might not like complete honesty as much as he thought he would. He got offended and said I was infantilizing him by suggesting he couldn't handle the truth about anything, then accused me of already hiding things from him, which proved we needed this policy. For 3 days, he kept bringing it up every time we talked, saying I must not trust him enough to be vulnerable or that I was emotionally immature for wanting to maintain boundaries in our marriage. He bought 5 books about radical honesty and left them around the house with specific pages bookmarked, then played podcast episodes at full volume while following me from room to room. Fine, you want brutal honesty? We'll do brutal honesty, I finally said when he woke me up at midnight to discuss why my resistance to transparency was a red flag. He literally clapped his hands like a child and said this would revolutionize our marriage and bring us closer than ever. The next morning, he asked why I'd been quiet at his parents' anniversary dinner last weekend, so I figured now was as good as time as any to start. Because your mother spent the entire night comparing me to your ex-girlfriend who's now a surgeon because she doesn't know that you helped her cheat her way through medical school, I said while buttering my toast. Giorgio's face went slack and he said that was unnecessarily harsh, but I reminded him this was his idea. Also, your dad kept touching our waitress inappropriately, and everyone pretended not to notice because that's what your family does with uncomfortable truths. He started to argue, but I kept going with the honesty he'd demanded. Your brother told me at Christmas that your parents only pretend to support your business ideas because they're terrified you'll have another breakdown like when you dropped out of law school. His coworker Miles came over to watch the game that afternoon, and Giorgio made the mistake of bragging about our new honesty policy and how evolved our relationship had become. Since we're being honest, Miles, you should know that Giorgio only invites you over because everyone else finds him exhausting and you're too polite to say no, I said while bringing them snacks. He actually thinks you're boring, but you always bring good beer and never stay too late, which makes you the perfect guest who requires minimal effort. Miles looked between us uncomfortably while Giorgio tried to laugh it off as a joke, but I reminded him that jokes weren't part of radical honesty. Oh, and that promotion he's been bragging about is actually just a lateral move with a fancier title because his boss wants him to quit but doesn't want to fire him. Miles suddenly remembered he had somewhere to be and left while Giorgio followed him to the door trying to explain. Thursday night was dinner with his parents at their country club, where his mother always made sure everyone knew how successful their family was. When his dad started his usual speech about building everything from nothing and the importance of family values, I decided radical honesty should apply here too. It's interesting you mention values when Giorgio spent $8,000 on OnlyFans last year that he hid in business expenses, I said while cutting my steak. His mother dropped her wine glass while his father turned purple, and Giorgio kicked me under the table frantically. He told me it was networking for his podcast about modern relationships, but honestly he was just addicted to a creator named Candy, who convinced him they had a real connection. His mother started hyperventilating while other diners turned to stare at our table. The credit card company called me about fraud, but it was just Giorgio buying her entire Amazon wish list, including a hot tub that got delivered to Phoenix. By Friday, Giorgio was begging me to stop the honesty policy, saying I'd misunderstood what he meant and that I was being cruel instead of constructive. You wanted brutal honesty, but only if it made you feel good about yourself, I said, while he sat on the couch looking defeated. You thought I'd tell you that you're secretly amazing and everyone else is wrong about you, but the truth is, everyone tolerates you because of your parents' money and connections. He started crying and said I was destroying him on purpose, that I'd turned something beautiful into a weapon. I sat down next to him and took his hand gently, looking into his eyes with complete sincerity, as his phone buzzed with another text from his mother asking where his father was. I showed him my phone screen and said, your dad isn't at a medical conference in Miami. His 23-year-old mistress just posted them shopping for cribs at Bye Bye Baby. Don't you think you should tell your mom the truth? Giorgio grabbed my phone out of my hand so fast I barely saw him move and started typing with shaking fingers that his dad was stuck in traffic somewhere on I-95. His hands trembled so bad he kept hitting wrong letters and having to delete them while tears rolled down his face onto the screen. I watched him type out this obvious lie to protect the same parents he'd spent 3 days demanding I be brutally honest with about everything. The phone buzzed immediately with another text from his mother asking why his father wasn't answering his own phone if he was just stuck in traffic. Giorgio looked at me with pure desperation in his eyes, silently begging me not to say anything about what we both knew was happening in Miami. I took my phone back from his sweaty hands and typed that we should all meet for coffee tomorrow morning to talk about something important. She texted back asking what was going on, but I just said we'd explain everything in person and turned the phone off. Giorgio spent the rest of that night pacing around our living room, alternating between screaming at me for ruining his family and having panic attacks about what was coming. He accused me of planning this whole thing from the beginning just to destroy him and everyone he loved. I reminded him calmly from the couch that he literally demanded complete honesty for 3 straight days, and I was just following his rules exactly like he wanted. He threw a coffee mug at the wall and it shattered while he yelled that this wasn't what he meant, and I knew it. Around 2 in the morning, when neither of us could sleep, I heard him on the phone with his brother in the guest bedroom warning him about what was about to happen. His brother wasn't even surprised about their father and admitted he'd known about other women for years but never said anything. This revelation sent Giorgio into another complete spiral about out what else everyone had been hiding from him his whole life. He came back to our bedroom crying and asking over and over why his brother never told him the truth about their dad. The next morning, Giorgio insisted on going to meet his mother alone first to soften the blow before showing her the evidence. I agreed, but told him I'd already forwarded all the screenshots to myself in case he tried to delete them to protect his father. He looked at me like I was a complete stranger who'd invaded his home and destroyed everything he thought was real. While he was gone meeting his mother at some coffee shop downtown, I opened my laptop and started researching divorce lawyers in our area. I found one named Vicky Ridley who specialized in high-conflict divorces and had amazing reviews from women in similar situations. I called her office and made an appointment for next week, then drove to the bank and opened my own checking account. The teller helped me transfer exactly half our joint savings into the new account, while I thought about how this marriage was definitely over. Giorgio came home 3 hours later looking like someone had died, which I guess in a way something had died that morning. His mother didn't believe him at first and accused him of making up lies to hurt her for some reason. Then she demanded to see the evidence herself, so he had to show her the Instagram posts of her husband shopping for baby furniture with a woman younger than Giorgio. She left the coffee shop without saying another word and went straight to her sister's house where she wasn't answering anyone's calls. His father started calling both our phones non-stop around lunchtime, leaving increasingly angry voicemails about defamation and slander. First, he threatened legal action saying we'd photoshopped everything and he'd sue us for destroying his reputation. Then he pivoted to offering us money to keep quiet about the whole thing and delete all the evidence. Giorgio listened to each message, getting more and more disgusted with the man he'd worshipped his entire life. By evening, his father showed up at our house, pounding on the front door, demanding to speak with me directly about my lies. Giorgio wouldn't let him in, and they ended up screaming at each other on our front lawn for everyone to see. The neighbors definitely heard everything about the affair and the baby, and even the $8,000 on OnlyFans. His father called me a vindictive bitch who'd poisoned his son against him, and Giorgio actually defended me for once. I wonder why Giorgio thought this radical honesty thing would work differently than it did. He seems genuinely shocked that his wife knew all these secrets about his family and spending habits. They almost got into a physical fight before his father finally drove away, threatening to cut Giorgio out of his will completely. After his father left, I went online and booked an emergency appointment with a therapist named Tess for both of us. Giorgio agreed to go only because he was desperate for someone to tell him how to fix this mess and save his family. I agreed to go because I needed to understand why I'd stayed quiet for so long about all these terrible truths. The next morning, Miles started texting Giorgio's phone over and over while we sat at the kitchen table in silence. I could see the messages piling up asking if everything was okay and why Giorgio hadn't shown up for work or answered any calls for 2 days. Giorgio pushed his phone across the table and asked me to text Miles back that he was sick with the flu. I shook my head and reminded him that lying wasn't part of radical honesty, even if it was to protect his job. He grabbed his phone and threw it hard against the wall where it shattered into pieces. The silence lasted about 10 minutes before my own phone started ringing with his mother's name on the screen. She didn't even say hello before demanding to know everything about the OnlyFans situation and asking if I had proof of what I'd said at the country club. I pulled up 3 years worth of credit card statements on my laptop while she waited on the phone. Each charge to OnlyFans was highlighted in yellow, along with the Amazon purchases and wire transfers to someone named Candy in Phoenix. I emailed her the entire folder of statements plus screenshots of the transactions that Giorgio had tried to hide as business expenses. She hung up without saying goodbye. 3 days later, we were sitting in Tess's office for our first therapy appointment that I'd booked. The waiting room smelled like vanilla candles and had those white noise machines that were supposed to be calming, but just made me more anxious. Giorgio spent the first 20 minutes telling Tess how I'd turned into someone cruel and vindictive who was destroying his family on purpose. He said I'd weaponized honesty to hurt everyone around him and that I was clearly having some kind of mental breakdown. Tess listened without interrupting, then asked him to explain why he'd wanted radical honesty in the first place. He stumbled over his words trying to explain about the podcast and how successful couples communicate, but couldn't give any real reason beyond saying it seemed like the mature thing to do. She asked him what he thought honesty meant, and he said telling the truth to build trust and connection. Then she asked him why he'd only wanted honesty when he thought it would benefit him. His face turned red and he started arguing that wasn't true, but Tess stayed calm and pointed out that he'd demanded honesty when I was comfortable with boundaries. She said he'd used the concept as a weapon first by making me feel guilty for wanting privacy in our marriage. Then she asked why he thought he could handle brutal truths when he'd had a complete breakdown just from the stress of law school 8 years ago. That's when he stood up and stormed out of the session, slamming the door so hard the certificates on the wall shook. I stayed in my chair while Tess watched him leave, then turned back to me with a small smile. She said we could continue the session just the two of us if I wanted. For the next 40 minutes, I told her everything, including things I'd never told Giorgio, like how exhausted I was from managing his emotions every single day. I told her about the time he'd thrown a plate at the wall because his boss criticized his presentation, and I had to calm him down for 3 hours. I told her about Christmas when his brother pulled me aside to warn me that Giorgio had these episodes his whole life. I told her how I'd learned to predict his moods and head off his tantrums by carefully managing what information he received and when. Tess validated that I wasn't crazy for finally snapping after years of walking on eggshells. She said what I'd done might seem extreme, but it was a natural response to being pushed past my breaking point. We scheduled individual sessions for me going forward every Tuesday morning. When I got home, Giorgio was passed out on the couch surrounded by empty beer bottles. The landline was ringing and the caller ID showed it was Arnie from Giorgio's office. I picked up and Arnie immediately asked if everything was all right because Giorgio hadn't shown up for 3 days and wasn't returning anyone's calls. I told him Giorgio was dealing with a family emergency, which was technically true even if Giorgio had caused it himself. Arnie sounded concerned, but then mentioned that several clients had been complaining about Giorgio's work quality for months. He said Giorgio had missed deadlines and showed up to meetings unprepared or sometimes drunk. I thanked him for calling and said Giorgio would be in touch soon, even though I doubted that was true. My phone buzzed with a notification from Instagram, and when I opened it, my stomach dropped. The mistress had posted more photos from Miami, and this time she was wearing a massive diamond ring on her left hand. The caption said yes to my forever, with a dozen heart emojis. I screenshot everything before the post could disappear. Within minutes, Giorgio's mother was calling me sobbing, so hard I could barely understand her. She'd seen the posts too, and couldn't believe her husband had proposed to someone else while still married to her. I stayed on the phone for 2 hours while she went through every emotion from rage to grief to humiliation. She kept asking how she'd missed the signs for 30 years, and I didn't have the heart to tell her she hadn't missed them, but had chosen to ignore them. 4 days later, Giorgio finally went back to work, but came home after lunch looking like he'd been crying. He said he'd broken down during a presentation in front of the entire team and couldn't stop sobbing. Arnie had pulled him aside and suggested he take some personal time to get himself together. The promotion he'd been bragging about for months was definitely off the table now, and there were whispers about letting him go entirely. That evening, my phone rang and my mother's voice was angrier than I'd ever heard it. Giorgio's father had called my parents trying to convince them to talk sense into me about destroying his family. My mother told him off in spectacular fashion, using words I didn't know she knew. She said he was a pathetic old man who couldn't keep it in his pants, and now wanted to blame everyone else for his mistakes. My father got on the phone and said if Giorgio's father contacted them again, he'd drive over and handle things personally. I'd never been more proud of them or felt more supported. The next morning, I was getting dressed when Giorgio came into the bedroom holding Vicky's business card that he'd found in my purse. His face was purple and he was shaking with rage as he accused me of planning this whole thing to destroy him and take everything in the divorce. I grabbed the card back from him and put it in my pocket while he followed me around the kitchen yelling about betrayal and how I'd been planning this all along. The doorbell rang and it was his brother looking worried because their mother had called him crying about the Instagram posts. Giorgio immediately started ranting to his brother about me destroying the family, but his brother just shook his head and said this wasn't the first time their dad had done this. He stayed for dinner and told us about 3 other women he knew about over the years, each time their mother found out and each time she stayed. Giorgio sat there with his mouth open like he couldn't believe what he was hearing, while his brother kept talking about how their dad would buy expensive gifts after each affair to smooth things over. The next morning, I had my solo appointment with Tess and spent the whole hour talking about how I'd been managing difficult people since I was a kid. She pointed out that Giorgio's demand for honesty was just another way to control me, another thing I had to manage perfectly or face the consequences. When she asked me to think about patterns in my life, I realized I'd been doing this dance forever, keeping quiet to keep the peace, swallowing my words to avoid fights. I left her office feeling clearer than I had in years, like someone had finally given me permission to stop being everyone's emotional manager. 2 days later, the credit card company called about suspicious activity on our account because someone had tried to buy a $1,000 plane ticket to Phoenix. I knew immediately it was for Candy and told them to freeze the card right away. When Giorgio got his card declined at lunch, he came home screaming that I was financially abusing him and trying to control him through money. I showed him the attempted charge on my phone and he went quiet, then started making excuses about how Candy was just a friend who needed help. His mother called that afternoon asking if I'd go with her to confront his father at his office downtown because she didn't want to go alone. We drove there in silence and walked into the waiting room to find a young woman with blonde hair sitting in one of the chairs, her hand resting on her very pregnant belly. His mother stopped dead in her tracks, but then walked straight up to the receptionist and said her lawyer would be in touch before turning and walking out with her head held high. The girl looked confused and asked who we were, but his mother just kept walking to the elevator without saying a word. That night, Giorgio broke down and begged me to try couples therapy to save our marriage, saying he'd do anything to fix things. I told him I'd only go if he also went to individual therapy for his sex addiction, but he immediately got defensive and said he didn't have an addiction, just an interest in adult content. The mistress posting engagement photos while still being the other woman, there's something really strange about that timing, especially with everything falling apart right now. Makes me wonder if she knew about the country club confrontation somehow and decided to stir the pot even more by going public with that ring. That told me everything I needed to know about whether he was actually ready to change or just trying to manipulate me into staying. The next week, I met with Vicky at her office and she went through our finances with a fine-tooth comb. She found a savings account Giorgio had opened 2 years ago that he'd been putting money into without telling me. It wasn't much, maybe $3,000, but she said it was proof of financial deception that would help in the divorce proceedings. She also found patterns of large cash withdrawals that matched up with times Giorgio said he was going on business trips that I now realized were probably never real. Miles came by on Tuesday afternoon to check on Giorgio and found him passed out drunk on the couch at 2 in the afternoon with empty beer bottles all over the coffee table. I came home from work to find Miles trying to get Giorgio to drink water and eat something while Giorgio kept mumbling about how everyone had abandoned him. Miles pulled me aside in the kitchen and said he'd been worried about Giorgio's drinking for over a year, but didn't know how to bring it up. I told him the truth about everything, the OnlyFans addiction, the family drama, the pending divorce, because after all, Giorgio had demanded honesty. Miles just nodded and said it explained a lot about Giorgio's behavior at work and why people had been avoiding him at the office parties. 3 weeks later, Giorgio's mother officially filed for divorce and had his father served with papers at the country club during their weekly golf game with all their friends watching. The gossip spread through their social circle within hours, and Giorgio's phone started blowing up with texts from family friends asking if it was true. He sat on the couch reading each message and getting angrier, finally throwing his phone at the wall and screaming that I'd destroyed his family's reputation. During our next therapy session with Tess, she asked Giorgio to take take accountability for his choices instead of blaming everyone else. He tried to deflect by saying I'd manipulated the whole situation, but Tess kept bringing him back to his original demand for radical honesty. After 40 minutes of going in circles, he finally admitted he thought honesty would only flow one way, that I'd tell him nice things about himself while he got to feel superior about being so evolved. Tess asked him if he understood that wasn't honesty, but just another form of control, and he started crying again. Meanwhile, I'd been looking at apartments online and found a nice one-bedroom closer to my work with good reviews and a doorman for security. When I told Giorgio I was planning to move out at the end of the month, he alternated between begging me to stay and calling me heartless for abandoning him during the worst time of his life. I stayed calm and stuck to the facts about our lease agreement and the timeline for separating our belongings, while he followed me from room to room, either crying or yelling depending on his mood. My phone lit up with a Facebook message request while I was hiding in the bathroom trying to get 5 minutes of peace from Giorgio's meltdown. The profile picture showed a young woman with bleached hair holding a designer purse, and the message preview said she was his father's mistress wanting to tell her side. I opened it to find 3 paragraphs about how she wasn't the only one, that there were at least 2 other women pregnant by him right now, and she wanted to make sure his wife knew everything before the lawyers got involved. I screenshotted everything and forwarded it to his mother's divorce lawyer without responding to the woman, then deleted the conversation and blocked her profile. Giorgio was still pacing outside the bathroom door asking if I was okay in there when his phone rang with Arnie calling from work. I heard him answer it and his voice immediately shifted to professional mode, but within seconds he was stammering and making excuses. Through the door, I could hear Arnie's voice getting louder, even though I couldn't make out the words. Giorgio kept saying it was just a rough patch and he'd get back on track, but when he hung up 20 minutes later, he slammed his fist into the wall hard enough to leave a dent. He told me Arnie had put him on a performance improvement plan after 3 different clients complained about missed deadlines and sloppy work. He said it was my fault for creating all this family drama that was distracting him, that I'd sabotaged his career on purpose by choosing now to destroy everything. I didn't bother arguing, just went to the kitchen to make dinner while he followed me, continuing his rant about how I'd ruined his life. The next morning, I had my individual session with Tess while Giorgio was supposed to be at work trying to save his job. She asked how I was handling everything, and I told her about him following me around the house, about the blame and the crying and the anger. She leaned forward in her chair and said she was concerned about the escalation, that his behavior was showing warning signs she'd seen before in other cases. She suggested I should consider moving out sooner rather than later for my own safety and peace of mind. I told her I'd been looking at apartments, and she helped me make a concrete plan, even pulling up moving company websites on her laptop. By the end of the session, I'd booked movers for the following week and felt lighter than I had in months. That afternoon, Giorgio's mother called while I was at the grocery store, her voice different from I'd ever heard it before. She thanked me for opening her eyes to what had been happening, said she'd wasted 30 years pretending everything was fine when deep down she'd always known something was wrong. She told me she'd started seeing her own therapist and wished she'd been brave enough to demand honesty years ago instead of playing along with the family image. She said watching me stand up to them had given her permission to finally stop pretending, and for the first time in decades, she felt like she could breathe. We talked for almost an hour while I sat in my car in the parking lot, and when we hung up, I realized we'd become actual friends instead of just relatives by marriage. 2 days later, Giorgio got a message on Instagram from Candy saying she was pregnant and needed financial support for the baby. He showed it to me like it was proof I'd been wrong about something, swearing it was impossible because they'd never met in person, that their whole relationship had been online. I looked at the message and the attached ultrasound photo that was clearly downloaded from Google Images, then looked at him and said that honesty meant admitting when you've been scammed. His face went red and he grabbed his phone back, blocking her account while muttering about how she'd seemed so real and genuine in their conversations. Our next couples therapy session was supposed to be about communication strategies, but Giorgio spent the entire 50 minutes listing everything he thought was wrong with me. He told Tess I was cruel, manipulative, vindictive, that I'd weaponized his request for honesty to destroy his entire life. He went through a detailed timeline of every harsh thing I'd said since the honesty policy started, every secret I'd revealed, every relationship I'd damaged. Tess let him talk for about 20 minutes before holding up her hand to stop him. She asked him to name one time in all of this where he'd taken responsibility for anything, just one moment where he'd acknowledged his own role in creating these problems. He sat there with his mouth open for a full minute before starting to deflect again, but Tess kept bringing him back to the question. He couldn't answer it. The session ended with him storming out while Tess scheduled another individual session with me for the next day. I'd already signed the lease on my new apartment by then, a nice one-bedroom place 20 minutes away with good locks and a responsive landlord. While Giorgio was at work trying to meet the requirements of his performance plan, I started packing my things into boxes I'd hidden in the garage. I was wrapping dishes in newspaper when I heard his car pull into the driveway 3 hours early. He walked in and saw the boxes, saw me packing, and his face crumpled like a little kid who'd had their toy taken away. He followed me from room to room begging me not to leave, crying that he couldn't handle losing me too, that he'd change, that we could work things out. I kept packing. He tried grabbing boxes out of my hands, but I just moved around him and kept working. He called his brother crying so hard he could barely speak, and an hour later his brother showed up with a truck to help me move. His brother took one look at the situation and started loading boxes without saying much, while Giorgio sat on the front lawn telling anyone who would listen that I was abandoning him in his time of need. The neighbors came out to watch from their windows and driveways as Giorgio made a scene, alternating between sobbing and yelling about betrayal. His brother finally pulled him aside and told him to stop embarrassing himself, that he was making everything worse. While we loaded the last boxes, his brother apologized for his family and said I deserved better than what I'd gotten from them. He said he'd always known Giorgio was difficult, but hadn't realized how bad it had become come until now. The local news picked up a story about a prominent businessman having his assets frozen due to multiple paternity claims, and even though they didn't use names, everyone in town knew exactly who they were talking about. Giorgio's mother texted me a laughing emoji, the first time I'd seen her express genuine joy in years. She said his father was staying in a motel now because the court had frozen their joint accounts too. 2 more women had come forward with babies on the way, both with lawyers demanding support. Giorgio's brother showing up to help her move instead of supporting him, that speaks volumes about what the family really thinks of this whole mess. Makes me wonder how long everyone's been pretending not to notice his problems. A week after I moved into my new apartment, my phone rang with Arnie's number. He said Giorgio hadn't shown up for an important client meeting that morning, the 3rd strike on his performance plan. He asked if I knew where he was, or if everything was okay. I gave him Giorgio's brother's phone number and told him I was no longer Giorgio's emergency contact, that he'd need to handle his own problems from now on. When I hung up, it felt like dropping a 1,000-pound weight I'd been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it had become. That first night alone in my new place, my phone started buzzing nonstop around midnight. The screen lit up over and over with Giorgio's name until I finally checked and saw 43 voicemails waiting. I put it on speaker and listened while making tea. The first few were him crying and begging me to come back. Then he switched to promising he'd change and go to therapy and never look at OnlyFans again. By message 20, he was screaming that I was probably already sleeping with someone else. Message 32 was him threatening to hurt himself if I didn't call back immediately. The last 11 were just him sobbing and saying my name over and over. I forwarded all of them to Vicky's email with a note asking if this would help with getting a restraining order. She texted back within minutes saying absolutely, and to keep documenting everything. Around 2 in the morning, Miles texted asking if I was awake. He said Giorgio had shown up at his door with a suitcase and wouldn't leave. Giorgio was sleeping on his couch now, but wouldn't stop talking about winning me back. Miles wanted to know if he should be worried about Giorgio doing something stupid. I told him to call 911 immediately if Giorgio made any threats about hurting himself or anyone else. Miles said Giorgio had already drunk half his liquor cabinet and kept showing him old photos of us. 3 days later, Giorgio's mother called asking if I wanted to get lunch to celebrate. I met her at a restaurant downtown and barely recognized her. She looked 10 years younger with a new haircut and clothes that actually fit her body. She ordered champagne and told me she'd filed divorce papers that morning. Her lawyer said she'd get half of everything plus alimony since her husband had hidden assets. She was taking salsa lessons now and had signed up for a trip to Greece with her sister. We toasted to radical honesty, finally doing something useful. She thanked me for opening her eyes to what her life had become. That afternoon, I had my regular session with Tess and broke down crying about the guilt. I kept thinking about how I'd blown up an entire family just to prove a point. Tess handed me tissues and reminded me that I only told truths that already existed. The affairs were happening before I said anything. The money was already being spent on candy before I mentioned it. The foundation was rotten long before I pointed it out. She helped me see that keeping quiet about problems doesn't make them go away. It just lets them grow bigger in the dark. 2 days later, Giorgio's brother called me at work. He said Giorgio had just been fired after showing up drunk and screaming at Arnie in front of clients. Security had to physically remove him from the building while he yelled about everyone betraying him. His brother wanted to warn me that Giorgio was spiraling hard and might show up at my apartment. I thanked him and immediately went to the hardware store. I bought extra deadbolts and installed them myself that night. I also got a security camera that connected to my phone and set it up facing my door. I barely slept for the next few nights, jumping at every sound in the hallway. Then at 3 in the morning on Saturday, the pounding started. Giorgio was outside my door screaming my name and demanding I let him in. I could see him on the camera swaying and slurring his words. I called 911 and stayed on the line while he kept pounding and yelling. The police arrived within 10 minutes and I watched on camera as they tried to calm him down. He kept telling them I was the one who destroyed his life and they needed to arrest me instead. They took him away and served him with the restraining order paperwork I'd filed earlier that week. The next Monday, Vicky filed our divorce papers officially. She'd marked fault on Giorgio's side due to financial deception and his addiction issues. The judge granted a temporary order requiring him to stay at least 500 feet away from me and my workplace. That night, I slept 8 hours straight for the first time in years. No phone buzzing, no worrying about Giorgio's mood, no managing his feelings, just quiet, peaceful sleep. Over the next few weeks, the drama with his family kept escalating. His father's mistress had her baby and immediately filed for child support. Then 2 other women gave birth within days of each other. Turns out his father had been busy all over town. The court ordered DNA tests, and all 3 came back positive. Giorgio's mother sent me photos from Italy, where she was using the money her husband had hidden in offshore accounts. She looked happy standing in front of the Colosseum with a glass of wine. During my next therapy session, I had a breakthrough about my whole life. Tess helped me realize I'd been managing difficult people since I was a kid with my alcoholic father. I learned early to keep quiet and not rock the boat to avoid his anger. Then I married Giorgio and did the same thing all over again. I spent years biting my tongue and managing his emotions just like I'd done with my dad. Not anymore though. Finally, after 2 months of chaos, Giorgio's brother called with news. He'd given Giorgio an ultimatum to either enter rehab or lose all family support forever. Giorgio chose rehab and checked himself into a facility for sex addiction and alcohol abuse. A few weeks into his program, I got a letter from him, 5 pages of excuses and explanations, but 0 actual accountability for anything. He wanted my forgiveness and understanding, but couldn't even admit what he'd done wrong. I threw it in the trash without responding. 3 months later, I sat in the courthouse waiting for our case to be called, while Vicky sorted through her files one last time. The judge reviewed all the evidence, including the financial records, the restraining order violation, and Giorgio's documented addictions. He ruled in my favor on everything, and I got the house, most of our savings, and 3 years of alimony payments. Giorgio had to appear by video link from rehab, and just nodded when asked if he understood the terms. Vicky shook my hand afterward word and said it was the cleanest divorce she'd handled in years because the evidence was so clear. That weekend, Miles texted asking if we could meet for coffee because he wanted to apologize. He sat across from me at the local cafe looking uncomfortable but determined to say his piece. He told me he'd known about Giorgio's problems for over a year, but never said anything because he didn't want to get involved. He introduced me to his sister the following week who'd gone through something similar with her ex-husband. We started meeting for lunch once a month, and it felt good to have people who understood what I'd been through. Giorgio's mother called to tell me she'd started dating someone from her dance class named Robert, who brought her flowers every week. She sounded younger on the phone and laughed when she said the whole honesty disaster was the best thing that ever happened to her. She'd never been happier or felt more free in her entire life. 6 months after the divorce, I was grabbing coffee downtown when someone called my name. I turned around to see Candy standing there looking completely different without all the makeup and filters. She recognized me from photos Giorgio had shown her and wanted to apologize for her part in everything. She admitted she'd scammed dozens of men the same way and was in therapy now trying to figure out why she did it. We talked for 20 minutes and she seemed genuinely sorry for the damage she'd caused. A year after everything exploded, I met someone at my book club who made me laugh without trying. He didn't need me to manage his emotions or pretend things were fine when they weren't. We were boring levels of honest about normal stuff like being tired or not liking each other's music choices. It was wonderful not having to perform or manage someone else's feelings all the time. Giorgio reached out 14 months after the divorce saying he'd completed his program and wanted to make amends as part of his recovery. I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near his brother's office where he worked now. He actually took responsibility for everything without making excuses or blaming me for how I'd handled things. He looked calmer and said therapy had helped him understand why he'd been so desperate for validation. The local country club still talked about his parents' divorce, which had become legendary in our town. His father lost everything paying child support to 4 different women who'd all had his babies within 6 months. His mother bought a beach house with her settlement money where she hosted dinner parties for other divorced women in the community. She sent me photos from her patio overlooking the ocean with groups of women toasting their freedom. Sometimes late at night, I think about how Giorgio demanding radical honesty accidentally freed everyone from their lies. His mother escaped a serial cheater who'd been fooling her for decades. I escaped a marriage where I had to constantly manage someone else's emotions and pretend everything was fine. Even Giorgio escaped his addictions and finally got the help he desperately needed. The truth really did set us all free, even though it wasn't the romantic transformation he'd imagined. He thought honesty would make us closer, but instead it showed us we needed to be apart. His mother thought her marriage was perfect, but honesty revealed 30 years of deception. Everyone in that family was living in denial until I started telling the truth they'd all been avoiding. Looking back now, I realized Giorgio gave me the greatest gift without meaning to. He gave me permission to stop pretending and start living authentically for the first time in my life. All right, that's a wrap for today, folks. Appreciate you hanging out with me and letting me ramble through all this. It's been a ride. Catch you next time. If you made it to the end, drop a comment. I love reading all your comments.